Thank you, George. This paper takes an international perspective and explores what I've come to see as the perennial anxiety within practical theology about where the theological focus of our project should be and the manner in which our theological work should be done. I examine approaches that were influential when I began my academic career in the field, and I ask what has become of them. I then inquire into modes of conceiving theology within PT, which are influential today. In the final section, I'll ask what abiding challenges lie in Duncan Forrester's concept of theological fragments and how these might be taken forward into contemporary practical theological engagement. And I've only got a few minutes to do this, so please forgive my appalling generalisations, polemical assertions and personal opinions that will be found throughout my talk. So I was reading Don Browning's newly published Fundamental Practical Theology in the early 90s, and it was that finally convinced me that what my friend Elaine Graham was saying, had been saying for a while, was true, that here was a discipline in motion, critical, intelligent, committed and practice-oriented, that was worthy of serious attention and was possibly capable of offering me a long-term relationship. This book is widely credited as issuing in a new epoch in practical theology as a discipline within and beyond the academy. It was creatively theological, portraying a model of critical correlation with Tillichian roots in action. Here in a work that was hermeneutically informed, certainly not naive, if a bit confused, we were presented with living accounts, we call them ethnographies these days, of congregations recognising the questions that culture was asking them and responding to them, with effective practical theological thinking, phronesis, which returned to the normative basis of theological understanding and reinterpreted this in the light of urgent needs. I was particularly impressed by the idea that the site of theological agency could be imaged in the faithful community rather than in the academy, and the notion that the transformative practice generated would itself speak with a new theological voice, although I'm mindful of Elaine's critique that Browning did not sufficiently examine his own privileging of normative theory over the wisdom of practice. What became of this exciting theological initiative? I think it was largely lost for many years, as congregational studies morphed into myriad Lilly Foundation-funded projects, focused much more upon the mechanics of congregational life and its sustenance. The concept of congregational theological agency in particular suffered neglect, and what might have been a very fruitful engagement in this area between the work of Browning and the brief, bright, shining work of James Hopewell never developed. This is my retirement project, by the way. I will consider the ethnography and ecclesiology movement later, but to my mind, the particular baton Browning offered for theological thinking has not yet been passed on. While Browning was proceeding with theological innovation in his particular Presbyterian way, Catholic theologians at Nijmegen were also engaged in innovative theological work under the inspirational academic leadership of Johannes van der Ven. They sought to institute a constructive process through which new theological thinking might emerge from an examination of everyday religious practices. This was to entail 4 stages. The first was an intense study of theological thinking on a particular and significant issue. The second was design of a research project in which the terms of a theological challenge might be operationalised. The third was conducting the research upon lived experience. And in the early days, the researchers looked at Christian approaches to the peace movement, perceptions of evil and suffering, broad topics. They weren't ecclesially focused. It wasn't churchy stuff. And the fourth moment was analysing the theological significance of the data and renewing and revising the theological tradition in the light of new insights. Now, I have very mixed feelings about empirical theology, and sadly there isn't the space to go into them here. Clearly, the starting point is a tradition which is seen as normative, but working within a Catholic context, and the project was soon taken up also by radical Barthians, the intention was to accord a new status to human action, practice. This was envisaged as being capable of challenging established theological thinking and developing renewed normativity. Because the approach was empirical, a status, that of sure knowledge, was accorded to what analysis of practice revealed. This might not be sustainable today, with our suspicion of empiricism and the reflexive turn in social research. However, this holistic project to generate innovative theological thinking was never fully realised. As empirical theology developed, stages 1 and 4 became increasingly submerged, and stage 3 came to dominate the whole. This is the attitudinal study basis. So the Journal of Empirical Theology today presents interesting studies, personality type-based inquiries into spiritual and pastoral preferences, varied inquiries into beliefs and behaviours, but it contains very little vital theology. Alongside work that was being pioneered in America by Browning and Europe by Van der Ven, other lively models of theological thinking were being sought by feminist practical theologians, and indeed many others across the globe, including Duncan here. Taking very seriously the combined insights of feminist theory and liberation theology, the emphasis was upon theological reflection upon experience, embodied, everyday, and emancipatory experiences. Elaine and I, together with our friend Frankie Wood, were decisively influenced by this mode of thinking, and our book, Theological Reflection Methods, originated out of a pedagogical and political commitment to enable people, individually or collectively, to engage actively with theological construction. This work is still a standard textbook in theological education, which is kind of sad, really. However, in my work as an external examiner in various sites of ministerial formation over the past decade, and latterly in my work with the Common Awards Scheme, which has embraced theological reflection as a core still, I've become convinced that people may be able to articulate what models of theological reflection might be, but they very rarely attempt to actually do it. Far more commonly, they say they are going to do theology about a particular issue. They describe the issue, often quite well, and then proceed to emote where reflection should be. Either that, or they simply incite the tradition and state what they have discovered confirms the truth of the Incarnation, reveals the power of the Holy Spirit, or whatever. I'm painting a picture of a discipline repeatedly presenting and indeed acknowledging the challenge to undertake processes of theological construction as practice engages with tradition, which has largely failed to address this task. But to move swiftly on, what about today? Two successful, dynamic, and interrelated movements of international significance, as judged by their prominence within the American Academy of Religion, for example, have emerged within the UK in recent years. They both stress the importance of theology with a big T in the enterprise of practical theology. I'm talking about the Ecclesiology and Ethnography Network and the Theological Action Research Network. In reading material published under the banner of Ecclesiology and Ethnography, their journals and collective publications, you very frequently come across the assertion that any research into practice must put theology first. The sentiment is echoed and re-echoed. Practitioners in turn also proclaim that the four voices of theology they employ, normative, concerned with scripture and tradition, formal, concerned with academic, espoused and articulated theology, and operative, a practice theology, they stress that their emphasis upon this in collaborative research on Christian communities ensures that their work is theological all the way down. However, these categories are not sufficiently integrated, and their heterogeneous, fractured natures are not sufficiently acknowledged. On close reading of the outputs of both networks, it's clear that theology is rhetorically invoked, but seldom actually deeply engaged with or created. Theology might be used to frame research questions, or there may be brief references to normative theological propositions when presenting the results of a research project. it's much less evident that constructive new theological thinking has been attempted, which is responsive to the context under consideration and the practice which is being performed. And I should say that I don't think this is because of the ecclesial focus of these particular movements or the theological allegiances of most members, with both Catholic and Protestant researchers tending to cluster around a Halvassian McIntyrean central ground. I don't think that's the reason that theology isn't emerging strongly. Pete Ward, founding leader of Ecclesiology and Ethnography Network, has always affirmed that the unstable site of ecclesia, as divinely instituted and humanly institutionalized, makes it an exciting place to destabilize and renew theological thinking. And I think he's right. So what I'm saying here is that theological creativity is not at all to be identified with a single approach to theological thinking, but that in our discipline, it's in short supply in all areas and fields. I've come to agree with the radical Catholic theologian Tom Burdam, who recently argued that practical theologians, for whatever reason, are not wrestling in the night with the theological challenges, but are deflecting these by substituting an indicative imperative formula, i.e., if this is so, then that is necessary, for genuine reflection. This manner of proceeding always leaves the if unchallenged. This if differs and refers to a theological tradition of assumed normative status, which thus becomes a protective shield or buffer. He writes, that is a defensive theological strategy. Along the lines of, if Christians are incarnational, then in this circumstance they should live like this. Or if God is merciful, then practice should go this way. The investment in the if is substantial. In a way, it is everything. Practical theology does not commonly see its task as to substantiate the grounding claims brought in for this normative buffering. Burdam reminds us that Christianity emerged through processes of purification, through which it distinguishes itself from Judaism and the religions of the ancient world. As such, it is constituted by discontinuity, and that should be acknowledged. He writes, to be constituted by discontinuity would be for practical theology to acknowledge the strangeness of the Christian heritage, its queer assemblage of materials and forms of life, and to advocate strangeness as a possible way of life for the souls for which it cares. Acknowledging the queer assemblage of materials and forms of life that we have invoked as a boundary point, an incontrovertible if, does not mean that our theological inheritance is useless or simply to be discarded as modern baggage. What has become sacred for us was born of strangeness, and we must read back beyond the boundary frame in which we have enclosed the normative tradition, acknowledge its multiple sources, its generative hybridity, the deep longings and desires, performances and practices through which it was created. From this perspective, the tradition then becomes potentially liberating as a witness to a vital energy within theological thinking that attempts to address ultimate reality as it presents itself in new forms and shapes. The resources to meet theological challenge have always been drawn from beyond a stable unitary core and always consisted of compounds of strangeness. Thus, practical theology, if it desires to be truly theological, instead of sheltering behind secure boundaries, must and can engage in new theological enterprises. And it's from this perspective that I've returned again to read Duncan's work in recent days, and I'll focus here upon Christian justice and public policy in particular. What immediately strikes you in this text is just how much theology there is in it. It's stuffed full of it, and it's broad and inclusive. Although in later years it's asserted that Duncan was deeply influenced by Halvassian models, they certainly don't have the only or the last word here. It's sad in a way to think how narrow we've become that have found the mix of theological sources and resources so refreshing. And though here we also find Duncan's articulation of the concept of theological fragments. And I must confess that when this book first came out, I was not convinced that this was a helpful or viable category, but I have changed my mind. I think that the concept is helpful in the terms that Duncan presents it. That is, that our culture does not have a perception of the full narrative of the Christian tradition, but that fragments of great value can be offered and fulfill a startling role. And furthermore, and very importantly, it encourages us to engage with theology as inherently a fragmentary and heterogeneous tradition. This, for Duncan, is the only tradition that we have on earth, and I'm quoting, "We should be cautious about regarding theology as some grand coherent narrative, rather than a series of illuminating fragments which sustain the life of a community of faith, which nurture them, and can, in some sense, become public truth." The last thing I would say about Duncan's thinking on fragments is that it encourages us to explore how the fragments might be rearranged into new patterns, what he terms radical new readings of tradition. Fragments encourage playful rearrangements of form, and they also remind us of our deep brokenness. Fragments call us to be formers and shapers of theological wisdom, moving with confidence beyond rhetoric and repetition and towards creative theological intervention. And I think we're on the cusp of a revival in work in this area within practical theology. The challenge of difficult times, provoking, as they did for Duncan, a deep interrogation of theological